Welcome to Tanach Study, and to this year's video series, Sefer Study. You are watching Archaeology Snapshots. In Archaeology Snapshots, we discuss the different aspects of each Sefer in Tanach Be'ezrat Hashem, and today we are dealing with Sefer Shemot, or Chumash Shemot. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what is Archaeology Snapshots? In Archaeology Snapshots, we hope to cover these basic four questions, which is: when is it happening? Who are the main players? Where are they located? And what do we know from history and archaeology that relate to the Sefer? And hopefully to try to do this in under 20 minutes. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing I'd like to discuss is actually where, the geography. So the important thing we need to know about the geography of Sefer Shemot is that it's all happening in a particular part of Egypt. The part of Mitzrayim is called Lower Egypt, and that's just because topographically, it's the lower part of the Nile River, which pours into the Mediterranean Sea. North and south had no bearing in the ancient world. North is based on the compass, which is a Chinese navigation tool unknown to the Egyptian. Their world was oriented based on the Nile, and so the Nile, which came from Central Africa, was up. That was Upper Egypt. This is Lower Egypt. Now, this particular part of Egypt that we're interested in is called, of course, the land of Goshen. Eretz Goshen, we're going to be looking at four different places: Eretz Goshen, Pitom and Ramses, where exactly was Kriyat Yam Suf, and we're going to go then into the second part of the Sefer, which is after Yetziat Mitzrayim, when we are in Midbar Sinai. So where is Eretz Goshen? Eretz Goshen is in the eastern part of the Nile Delta, which is this green, fertile area of Lower Egypt. And we know this from the story of Yosef. We know this from Yaakov and his children, where they travel down to Egypt, and they're basically next to the capital. As Yosef says, I want Yaakov to be next to the capital. It's also the particular land which is fertile and appropriate for grazing for animals, as opposed to the desert further south or in Upper Egypt. And we basically know that that's the area, and we're going to see later on, when it comes to when the story is happening, why this identification of Eretz Goshen is actually very, very critical to understanding the story. The second part of the story is, of course, Pitom and Ramses, which are the two cities which Bnei Israel as slaves built for Paro. The Talmud Yerushalmi identifies Ramses as Pelusium, which you may recognize from Masechet Yoma, Pilusin. There's a particular quality of linen that's made for the Bigdei Kohen Gadol for Yom Kippurim, that's Pilusin. So that comes from Ramses. Pitom and Ramses are identified as somewhere in the eastern delta, cities which were built by Ramses the Great, so that's of course going to fit in later on. And Kriyat Yam Suf. So there are several different opinions as to exactly where Bnei Israel crossed Yam Suf. I'm going to be taking Yoel Elitzur's position, which is explained in his Makom Parasha, which is that it's where the Suez Canal is, which makes a lot more sense than saying it's further up for a number of reasons. And that's going to be the position we're going to be taking for this video. Next on is the story of the Midbar, the desert. Now this map, which is from the Da'at Mikra and also from the Da'at website, but Da'at Mikra is a very, very important resource which we're going to be using. And this shows you the trajectory of Bnei Israel. There's different opinions of where we went. And what's important for us here is, of course, the identification of where exactly was Har Sinai, where did we get the Torah, and of course where is the Midbar Sinai, the desert in which we spent basically 38 or 40 years in the desert. So let's try to understand, what exactly do we mean when we say Midbar Sinai. So when we say Midbar Sinai, it's in modern English, it's called the Sinai Peninsula, which means the half island, or Chatzi Ha'i Sinai in modern Hebrew. That actually includes several different deserts which have different characteristics to them, different terrain, and each one of them is given a different name in Tanach. So there's Midbar Shur, which is closer to Eretz Israel, it's further north. You can see it underneath what's called the Derech Eretz Plishtim, on the upper coast of the Sinai Desert. That's the way which we didn't go in Parashat Beshalach, V'lo nacham Elohim derech Eretz Plishtim ki karovu. That's the short way up, but we rather went roundabout way. There's Midbar Paran, which is again also north, but further towards the Negev. There's Midbar Sin, there's Midbar Sinai, which is a general term for more like the middle area, and then there's the lower part, which is called Chorev, or Midbar Chorev, and there's Har Sinai called Har Chorev. And again, based on Maitlis, that's the opinion we're going to be taking as to where Har Sinai is, but there are about 5 different suggested identifications. So let's go back to the Suez Canal. which is where we say we crossed over the sea, and you can see that this dotted line sort of tells you where exactly we would have crossed and our trajectory. The next stop is, of course, Har Sinai or Jabal Katerina. There is an ancient tradition that that's where Har Sinai was, and indeed the terrain sort of fits the description of the stones and the stones that Moshe Rabbeinu then hit, and water and so on, as opposed to sand and desert, which doesn't really fit the description of hills. So Har Chorev, and of course Derech Yam Suf, you can see that it splits into two different sides of the Sinai Peninsula. You need to know where we're holding in the story to know which part of Yam Suf we're actually in, which is very, very important. So this is the story of where our story takes place. Now we're going to get into the question of when does the story take place, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is a lot of fun. So this is going to be the bulk of the video, and in order to understand when the story happens, let's just frame the story. So first of all, Yosef goes down to Egypt, becomes the viceroy of Egypt, right? And then Yaakov and his children come down to Egypt, and within no time at all, Bnei Israel paru vayirbu vayishretzu vayatzmu b'meod meod, we become a great and plentiful nation, vatimaleh haaretz otam, and we fill the land. So we have a large population, and we are, of course, in the area of Goshen. And then we have this ploy to subjugate us. Hava nichakmalo pen yirbeh. What is this whole concern about Am Yisrael perhaps rebelling and joining an enemy, a usurper? So we need to understand the context of what's going on in Egypt at the time in order to appreciate the question of where in time this happens. So this image from the Prince of Egypt shows the Shi'abud. I'm going to be using some of those pictures. They're beautiful. But the important thing we need to understand is what led up to Vayakom Melech Hadash al Mitzrayim. A new king rose up to Egypt. Asher lo yada et Yosef. He did not acknowledge or know Yosef. So what is that? So in order to understand that, we're going to talk about a period in Egypt, a period of instability, which is called the Second Intermediate Period, which spans a couple hundred years. This period of time has 14, 15, 16, 17 dynasties, the dynasties which are numbered this way, not getting into that right now. But these dynasties are dynasties of a foreign invading nation or people who are called the Hekachasut or Hyksos in the Greek pronunciation of the Egyptian, which just means that these are strange rulers. So let's get into it. So the Second Intermediate Period, we just came out of, let's just take the 12th dynasty, because that's more or less the period of Avraham Avinu, the Avot, the Middle Kingdom, which we mentioned last week. The Middle Kingdom, or the 12th dynasty, was a period of immense literary accomplishment, of great public works. It was a lengthy period. There's a lot of stability of rulership, and it's a contemporary of Hamurabi, and we're actually going to get to Hamurabi, the king of Babylon, and his code of laws in our highlights later. And there's this administration which divided Egypt into two administrative centers, Upper and Lower Egypt, which is a division which really lasted until about 1000 BCE. So it was pretty stable for a long time. But the 14th dynasty there's actually a description of this in a papyrus which is called the Admonitions of Ipuwer, where he talks about foreigners have become native people everywhere. And Manetho, who is a Greek period Egyptian historian, calls them invaders from the east, or Semitic people. The Egyptians again call them Hekachasut, and the Greeks call them Hyksos. Now, I'm putting away the long-standing myth that the Jews are the Hyksos. That's not true. That's been proven conclusively. I'm not getting into that. But what's important for us is that they settled in the Nile Delta, the area which we identified more or less as Eretz Goshen, with their capital in a city called Avaris, which is again in the Nile Delta, in the eastern delta. And they had connections with the eminent powers of the Near East all the way to Crete and so on. So these were powerful people who basically controlled Egypt for a very, very long time. And in this environment of the Second Intermediate Period, Yosef was able to rise to power as a non-Egyptian, as an Ivri, which would not have been possible under indigenous Egyptian rulership. It just couldn't have happened. And so this is when Bnei Israel were able to thrive there. Now, these Hyksos were driven out of the land finally, after several attempts, by King Yahmes, or Ahmose, as we say in English, Ahmose. And he was the progenitor of what was then called the 18th dynasty, beginning what's called a period of time which is called the New Kingdom. And the new kingdom is really the standard for Egyptian rulership, and we're going to see why very, very soon. It includes 3 sets of dynasties, starting with Ahmose, who's dynasty 18, Ramses the First is dynasty 19, and dynasty 20 is already the time of Yoshua, and perhaps even going into Beit HaMikdash HaRishon, the first temple. So the next question which we really need to tackle, and this is what I'm going to focus on primarily, is the question of when exactly did the Exodus happen? So let's get into this story. So this beautiful picture from the Prince of Egypt is a great example, a great way to springboard this conversation. This picture shows you on the left-hand side is Moshe growing up like an Egyptian prince, the Prince of Egypt as the movie is called. And on the right hand you have Ramesses II, and his father Seti the First is shown there as the king at the beginning of the story. And this is a beautiful way to understand that Moshe Rabbeinu really grew up in the palace, in the whole environment with all the trappings of a king of Egypt. He understood Egypt. And so it's a beautiful way to start the conversation. Paro Ramses, Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, actually is the 19th dynasty and not in the 18th. And we're going to get into that very, very soon. So the question, of course, is, again, Yetziat Mitzrayim, Kiryat Yamsuf, when did that happen? In order to understand when that happened, I'm going to have to go over some highlights from the 18th dynasty and then the 19th dynasty. And I'm going to present 2 different opinions as to when the Exodus actually happened. The first opinion, which says that it happened in the 18th dynasty, is primarily Yitzchak Maitlis in Parashat Drachim and Yoel Elitzur in Makom Parasha. The main protagonist for the 19th dynasty, other than general scholarship and academia, when they acknowledge that it actually happened, which isn't always the case. If it did happen, it's in the 19th dynasty. So in this case, the protagonist is going to be Rabbi Joshua Berman of Bar Ilan University, who just came out with a new book called Ani Ma'amin, which is the evidence for the Exodus, archaeology, and the 13 principles of faith. Magid Book Press. So anyway, these are all great books, which I'm going to recommend. So let's get into the story. We're going to start with Dynasty 18, which is a period of about 300 years, and that dates the Exodus to about 1440 BCE. All these dates are BCE, so just add 2020 to them if you're watching this when this comes out, and you'll get that it's 3,400 years ago. Now, how do we get to this math? First of all, let's just give an overview of what do I mean when I say Dynasty 18. So Dynasty 18, or the New Kingdom, was started by Ahmose, Yahmes, who leads Egypt on the path to imperial expansion. So I'm going to go a little bit over the 18th dynasty so you understand it, and these things are going to tie into what we're going to talk about later. So the 18th dynasty includes great conquerors such as Thutmose or Thutmese III, who conquered Megiddo in Canaan, and Thutmese IV, who made an alliance with the Mitanni, a powerful kingdom in Asia and in the area of Turkey. And the famous Akhenaten, who I'm showing you a picture of Akhenaten. He actually has a very distinct artistic style. He does not look like the regular Egyptian kings. This is known as the Amarna period because he moved the capital of Egypt to what is called today Amarna, and there's a massive archive found there of correspondence in Akkadian with kings in Canaan, so it's a fascinating story. And he tried to convert Egypt to worshiping only the sun god Aten. And it's in his time where the Hittim, the Hittites, overwhelmed the Mitanni, and this led to a battle which lasted for 3 generations between Egypt and the Hittites until the Battle of Kassas on the Orontos River, which is between Lebanon and Turkey today, a battle which was only settled with the King Ramses II, Ramses the Great, in the 19th dynasty, and we'll definitely discuss that later. So, of course, there's the very famous King Tut, King Tutankhamun, and he is also part of the 18th dynasty. And he's world famous for his funerary treasures, which are of importance to our highlights, and the Mishkan, the making of the Mishkan for this Sefer. Now, this dynasty ended with Horemheb. Horemheb was a former general who had no children, and so after him rose another Egyptian named Ramesses I, and he began what's called the 19th dynasty. But now let's get into the argument about why would the Exodus, why would Yetziat Mitzrayim actually be in the 18th dynasty? So there's a few different factors which I'm going to put out there, and again, I'm going to leave this to you to decide and to discuss. You can always review this video and go over it because it's a lot of information and I'm trying to simplify it. So there's a few things that happen in the 18th dynasty. We have the collapse of the Bronze Age in Eretz Canaan much later, which is why people think it's the 19th dynasty. They say the collapse of the Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, when invaders came into Canaan and destroyed and burnt cities. That's 200 years later. That's like the year 1200, 1275 BCE. And they say that that's probably Yoshua coming into Canaan. Not getting into what that might be alternatively if not, but Meitlis and Elitzur basically say, while the building operations and achievements led scholars to believe that Ramses the Great was the Paro of the Exodus, the math doesn't add up. So let's just do some of this math, okay? So Shlomo HaMelech built the Bet HaMikdash, according to the Tanach, 480 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, the Bet HaMikdash, we can, based on later chronology, on the story of Paro Sheshak, who in year 5 of Rechavam, the son of Shlomo, sacked the Bet HaMikdash, we can date when the Bet HaMikdash was built, because we know how many years Shlomo ruled, and we know how many years Rechavam ruled when Sheshak, also known as Paro Shoshenk, came and invaded the coast of Canaan to plunder, to refill the treasury, and he also plundered the Bet HaMikdash. Now, if that was in year 5 of Rechavam, then, and this conquest, by the way, while not mentioning Yerushalayim specifically, is written up in the temple in Karnak, that was the year 924 BCE, which means that the building of the Bet HaMikdash was 965 BCE. So just go back 480 years, and you pretty much get to this year, right? More or less. If you stay with the conventional chronology, what you end up doing is cutting the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim up until the Bet HaMikdash in half, and then you have to deal with stretching the times and what to do with it. It gets very, very complicated chronologically. So that's number one. So Ramses now, but that means that Ramses and his son Mar-Neptah, who we may talk about in a bit, were ruling overlapping the time of Yehoshua and perhaps going into the time of the Shoftim. Now, that basically would mean that while we left Mitzrayim, we should know that at the time, Ramses, as well as his son Mar-Neptah, one of his 100 sons, Mar-Neptah, and the later successors, actually had control over Derech Eretz Pelishtim, over the coast, over Canaan, which is probably why they're not mentioned in Yehoshua and Shoftim so much, except for a few skirmishes, which are mentioned in Shoftim and Shmuel Aleph, as Meitlis points out. But the Egyptians are pretty much not in the scene, and if they're not in the scene, that makes a lot more sense. But if you're saying that this is in the 19th dynasty, then we haven't left Egypt. We're still under the influence of Egypt while in Canaan. And so it makes a lot more sense to put it a few hundred years earlier, even though it's not as shiny, right? To say that it's Ramses the Great. There's the question of the identification of the cities and their building. That's basically saying that perhaps there was a Ramses, the city named Ramses, not the person named Ramses. It's not out of the question, but we don't really know. Now, Ramses' son, Paro Mar-Neptah, was a bit of a weaker king, and he was constantly fending off invaders who came in from the east, from Canaan, and so on. And one of the campaigns which he describes is conquering cities, coastal cities like Gezer, Yanoam, and Ashkelon. And he mentions also laying waste to the seed of Israel, saying that they are no more. And he actually writes Yisrael because the Egyptians did not pronounce the letter Lamed. So it's not Israel, it's Israel. So if Mar-Neptah would have been talking about obliterating like a whole group of people who he's calling Israel, whether or not you trust him and you take him for his word, how could that have possibly been the case a mere few decades after Yetziat Mitzrayim? We're not a nation yet. We're not settled yet. We're barely in Eretz Israel. So it doesn't really add up to say that it would have been in this time of Ramses the Great and his son Mar-Neptah, who already mentions Israel, the earliest mention of Israel. Rather, it makes a lot more sense that we were a little more settled at that time, which is 200 years. It's in the middle of the time of the Shoftim. Now, while we're pretty much going along with saying why it is the 18th dynasty, I'm trying to point out why it's not the 19th dynasty. And just to repeat, so the weakening of Egypt after Thutmoses IV would make a lot more sense with the statement that Egypt is no longer powerful. The way you've seen Egypt today, they're no longer going to be as powerful. And indeed, that happens in the 18th dynasty. While in the time of the Shoftim, in the 19th dynasty, they did gain some power, but that's much longer. That's 200 years later. And so it doesn't really add up to say that. Okay? Furthermore, During the 19th dynasty, Egypt again maintained a degree of control over the coast, meaning that we didn't really leave. We're still under the control of Egypt. Now, there's one more detail which is a little bit ambivalent. I'm not presenting this conclusively again. This is for you to think about. The Amarna letters between Akhenaten, this king here on the right, who is one of the grandson of the grandfather of King Tut, Tutankhamun, also known as Amenhotep IV. He changed his name to Akhenaten. So we're saying the Exodus was Amenhotep II, Amenhotep II. So the Amarna letters are in Akkadian, and they're correspondence between kings in the coast, kings in Canaan, like Yerushalayim and Ashkelon and Gezer, with the king in Egypt, Akhenaten, asking him for support from these raiders called the Habiru. Now, it's easy to fall into the trap of saying Habiru sounds phonetically like Ivri, but that for a number of reasons that doesn't really add up, especially because if you think about how Egyptians referred to Israel, to Bnei Israel, or they called us Asiatics. There was no particular name for Ivri, and there's other reasons which have to do with linguistics. I'm not going to get into it, but there are those who suggest that perhaps these Habiru have something to do with the invading Bnei Israel at the time, and so there are those who place Yeshua in the time of Akhenaton. Again, it's open for debate, but that's part of the interesting conversation. So that's as far as it goes in terms of the 18th dynasty. Now let's go into the 19th dynasty, which is really exciting. The New Kingdom, 19th dynasty, Ramses the Great. And you're looking at the magnificent palace or temple of the sun in Abu Simbel in southern Egypt on the border of Sudan. This is a temple which was actually moved by UNESCO, cut into 16,000 pieces and lifted to the top of the mountain in order to allow the building of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s, but we don't have the time to discuss that. But this is a massive, one of many massive monuments. So let's talk about the 19th dynasty. And this is according to the opinion of Berman and the general consensus of academia, which discussed the Exodus, saying it's more or less the year 1200 BCE. So what is the 19th dynasty? The 19th dynasty is most famous for Ramses the Great, who ruled for 67 years, and it was only recently surpassed in rulership by the Queen of England, but he's one of 4 rulers in the world who ruled for that long. He was very busy. He had about 100 children, and his reign was marked by diplomatic, military campaigns, triumphs, monumental buildings and operations that set the standard for future rules. And that's what we have in the Prince of Egypt. Now his name, Ramesses, is also Usr Matre or Ozymandias in the classical writers, so that's something fun to know. And his son, Marneptah, authored the earliest mention of Israel in archaeology and history. And his stela, which I just mentioned earlier, talks about the plundering of Canaanite cities such as Yanoam, Gezer, and Ashkelon. He also mentioned Israel is laid waste and his seed is no more. So again, Israel, that's the pronunciation, and there's a determinative of people, not a nation or a city, as opposed to the other ones which are determinatives of cities. So it kind of might fit, according to Berman, in terms of the kind of settlement that we had at the time. And what interest would they have had in plundering Israel at the time, who had no treasures to offer in terms of, the reason for plundering in the first place? So it could also fit. But he was constantly under attack, having to defend his territory from invading Lydian tribes as well as sea people. Anyway, so Rabbi Berman points out that there are compelling reasons for seeing the Exodus as taking place in the 19th dynasty, specifically under Ramesses the Great. And this has to do a lot with some literary details, which are fascinating. So we mentioned Paro Shoshenk. We're not going to get into that now. We spoke about that, but I want to get into Ramesses the Great. And I'm going to talk about basically 4 reasons why Berman believes that the Exodus took place in Dynasty 19. Number 1, the building of Pitomen Ramses, Pi Ramses. We know that there was a city named Pi Ramses, or Pelusion, which was built by Ramses the Great. Now, you can argue from the other side, that's the city, this is a person, it might be the same name, but that doesn't mean it's the same place. Okay, fine. The name Paro in Sefer Shemot is typical of what's called the New Kingdom, which is again also the 18th dynasty, but it has to be the New Kingdom, because after that, Paro is not just called generically Paro, but rather Paro Sheshak, Paro Chofra, Paro Necho, right? Paro, and so on and so forth. So they have his name in it. But the 2 details which I want to go into is the Battle of Kassas. And the Battle of Kassas is perhaps the most famous, publicized battle of the ancient world, between Pharaoh Ramses the Great and the mighty Hittite Empire. And this is after 3 generations where finally the battle was pretty much ended at a draw. I mean, each side sort of says that they won, so how much can you actually trust these people? But there's also some literary issues that come up in the way the Temple of Karnak praises the victories of Pharaoh Ramses and describes his encampment and his sort of machaneh, which is like a portable temple for him, which are really, really fascinating and enthralling. And these ones are a bit of a compelling argument for it being in the time of Ramses the Great. So the Battle of Kadesh of Ramses the Great. Now the Battle of Kadesh of Ramses the Great is mentioned as one of the most publicized battles in the ancient world. And I want to mention, and this is basically what Berman argues in length in his book, is that the Battle of Kadesh, there's many similarities between the propaganda writing, the Egyptian propaganda about it, and the Shirat Hayam, and the nations, and the way it talks about Yad Chazaka v'Zohar Netuya, and so many things are so similar from the Battle of Kadesh and Shirat Hayam. Now, since this was the most publicized event in the ancient world, believe it or not, so there is no question that it was known to us. It was known to who wrote the Torah. Hashem wrote it using this language. And there's no question that it influenced the way Hashem chose to write the Torah and not the other way around. You couldn't say that, Ramses the Great wanted to sound like the Torah. Like, why would he have known about it, right? It's the other way around, makes a lot more sense. Now, verses, again, such as an outstretched arm, Biyad Chazaka B'Zohar Netuya, and much more, are Egyptian royal propaganda, which Ramses the Great writes about himself. Now, literary appropriation of the oppressor and the appropriation of symbols of the enemy are an established form of cultural and spiritual resistance. We're going to use their symbols and flip them around to mean something different for us. And that's something that was very, very important to understand in terms of how Torah relates to what was common knowledge in the ancient world. So finally, I want to talk about not only that, I'm not going to get into those details, but I'm going to get into the parallels between the encampment, the machaneh, the temple of Ramses the Great in this battle, which are described on the palace in Karnak, and the similarities between that to the Mishkan. Now, there's a lot to say about the similarities between temples in the ancient Near East and the Mishkan and the Bet HaMikdash. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but more in Chumash Vayikra and Chumash Bamidbar, and perhaps later on in the Nevi'im. So right now I'm just going to put that out there in a generic way. But just look at from Joshua Berman's book, look at the similarities between the architecture of the camp of Ramses the Great and the Mishkan, even in terms of their direction, north-west, north-south, east-west orientation, and the tent, and the fact that there were 4 encampments of soldiers on each side of the tent, and Ramses is in the center. And the way Ramses' name is described is almost similar to the Keruvim, with 2 winged images of Horus protecting his name, which is in sort of a circle, which we call a cartouche, which is French, but it's so similar, it's really, really striking. And then, of course, there's also the literary similarities. So this is a very, very compelling argument for saying that the Torah is appropriating these concepts which come from Egypt and using them in a good way, using them for us, taking from the best. So that is pretty much both sides of the argument in terms of placing Yetziat Mitzrayim in the New Kingdom, either in the 18th dynasty or in the 19th dynasty, and I'm going to leave that to you to discuss and debate and decide. And now we're going to be going into some highlights. The first highlight we're going to be going into, and really briefly, is the code of law. So we have Matan Torah, right? We receive the Torah, and there's the 10 Dibrot, there's what's called the 10 Commandments, even though it's actually about 14 different commandments, but 10 statements, right? The 10 Aseret Dibrot, Devarim. Now, there's also Parashat Mishpatim, which is full of many different halachot. And what's fascinating is that in the ancient world, there actually are quite a few different codices, codes of law. Not codices, my bad. Codes of law. There's Lipit Ishtar, king of Isin, which is about 1930 BCE from Sumer. There's Ishnuna's laws from 1770 BC. That's Akkadian. There's Hamurabi from 1750, who is an Akkadian king, and this is actually found in Shushan, in Susa, in Shushan. So you can imagine that this is going to be in the Louvre, which is our background, because the French are the ones who excavated the Persian Empire in Iran. So it's kind of cool. And we're going to talk about Hamurabi in just a bit. It has 282 statutes. We're going to talk about that. Then there's the laws of the Hittites, either Hatushili or Telepinu, which is about either 1650 or 1500 BCE. That's Indo-European. So anyway, there's a lot of different codes of law. This is not an unusual thing. But there are some things which are unique to Torah, unlike any law that's ever been seen in the world before, and I'd like to point out two of those. So Torah does have similarities in many ways to some of these laws. There's so many different topics which have to do with civil and criminal matters, stipulations concerning slavery and theft and debt resolution and property sales and taxes and marriage and betrothal and adoption and sexual misconduct and taxes and all of the above. And there's a very strong difference between slaves and free people in all these codes of law. Torah, as opposed to that, here's a picture of Hamurabi. Torah, as opposed to that, introduces many different things which are different. Two of them are significant. One of them, which I'm going to mention here, one of them is morality is legalized. And in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, we have the edut, the testimony of God's connection to us as opposed to a statue of a god. And that already tells us a world of differences between the way the world looks at rules and laws given by God to kings as opposed to given to humankind, to Am Yisrael, as a covenant between Am Yisrael and God. So Hashem is good, God is good, and morality is legalized. But the other thing is Shabbat. Shabbat, a mandatory day of rest for all. Something which even the Romans, as advanced as they were, just could not comprehend. What do you mean there's a day of rest? What do you mean a day of rest? And it's this idea, the gift of a legal day of rest, and actually introducing 7-day weeks and legalizing that also, it's changed the world. It's one of the reasons that we say on Shabbat, Zecher L'Yitziat Mitzrayim. How could it possibly be that Shabbat, which commemorates the God taking a day of rest on creation, that is Zecher L'Yitziat Mitzrayim? Because if it wasn't for Shabbat, nobody would know about this nation who was formed through Yitziat Mitzrayim. And so Yitziat Mitzrayim is really our message, but it's through Shabbat that we spread that message to the world. And so that's two of some of the most important differences between the way the rules work in other codes of law and the Torah. Now let's go into our second to last highlight, and that is the Chet HaEgel, the golden calf, perhaps the biggest thorn in our backside. And the golden calf must be understood in the context of Egyptian mythology and beliefs. And so there are many different things in Sefer Shemot which we need to understand in context of Egyptian mythology. For example, the 10 Makot. I mean, if God says, "Uv'chol Elohei Mitzrayim me'aseh shvatim," I will make an example of all of the gods of Egypt, you need to know something or do about the gods of Egypt to appreciate what exactly the 10 Makot are doing. So the Egyptian beliefs about the Nile, God comes and strikes the Nile. And then you go incrementally up to the force of day and night and life and death and the universe, right? You finally make your way up there. So that's just some examples. But I'd like to get into Chet HaEgel. Chet HaEgel actually relates to the cow. Now, the bull and the cow are very important symbols, ideas, manifestations of powers in the world, which are so famous in the ancient world. So, for example, Zeus is really the bull. He rides the bull, but it comes from the Canaanite god Baal, the thunder god, or Hadad. The bull has many, many different manifestations, and there's many different bull gods in ancient Egypt. So Egypt has a lot of bull, and I'm not even talking about Chicago. But the cow is significant because the cow goddess is called Hathor, which comes to the word Horus, which is just the Egyptian for whore or chor. So you think the English is Horus, it's actually chor. It's kind of cool. So Hathor, or Hathor, as we say in English, is the cow goddess of love, known also as the golden cow of creation and so on, and a goddess who represents motherly love and dependency. So this example of a papyrus with the cow goddess who has the sun between her horns and has the stars of the sky on her body, there's some person nursing from her, which is kind of weird, but that's because it's representing motherly love. And so that dependency, that slave mentality, was an inseparable part of the issues and the problems with Chet HaEgel. And so I'm just showing you an example of one item which has to do with Hathor from one of the royal wives of Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. And this is in the Met. This is a wooden mirror plated with gold and silver of Hathor, who has cow ears with a human face, and it's gold. And this is also reminiscent of the Mar'ot HaTzovot, the bronze mirrors which the women used to donate to the Mishkan to make the Kior. They were commoners' mirrors, which are bronze, which you can see many of them in ancient Egypt, but they're all associated with the sexuality and the revelry around Hathor, around Hathor. And so the revelries around Har Sinai, Vayakumu Am L'Tzachek, those revelries have to do with the worship of Hathor, of Hathor. Fascinating thing to notice, and undoubtedly there is a connection between the two. And now, last but not least, the making of the Mishkan, the moment we've all been waiting for. Melechet HaMishkan, we're going to be talking about the crafts and the materials. So there are many materials which are involved in the making of the Mishkan. We have the wood, we have zahav, kesef, nechoshet, chelet, argaman, tolat, shani, veshesh, orot, elim, and gemstones. So we have gold, silver, different types of fabric, different types of metal, different types of wood, right? And then you have all of the craft involved in making them. Imagine the level of craftsmanship that would be necessary for Betzalel or Holiav and all of the Nashim, all the women and the men who are involved in the intricate work of making this magnificent portable Mishkan. How did they get the materials? Yes, Bizat Hayam and Mitzrayim, but I want to show you something really cool. How did they even know how to use these materials? And so for this, I want to take you into the most famous pharaoh of the ancient world in terms of archaeological finds, and that is, of course, King Tutankhamun, or King Tut of the 18th dynasty. Now, King Tut's exhibit is world famous, and it's traveling the world now and will hopefully soon settle permanently in the new museum in Cairo, which is soon opening up. And I want to show you some of the treasures of King Tut so you can appreciate that this is, according to Nachliel Selavan, this is contemporary of the of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and according to Berman and the conventional chronology, it's happening much earlier. But either way, it serves the same point. These materials were available, and the fine craftsmanship was known. And the miracle really is that God inspired and imbued Betzalel, Oholiav, and everybody with the ability to produce these wonderful kelim, but the knowledge existed at the time. So let's take an example. There's gold, there's lapis, there's stones, there's laying it in, right? There's a golden aron. You can see in the background as well, there's a golden plated aron on the outside with gold on the inside. It's very similar to the Ark of the Covenant, to the Aron HaBrit and the Mizbech HaZahav, right? All of these different things, like you're looking at echoes of that from the culture in which we were with those materials and those skills. They definitely were in existence. Let's take a look at just some other of these magnificent treasures that were found with King Tut. So we have the hook and the flail, which he held in his hand as symbols of rulership. And we have also golden chains, and you're thinking about the various golden chains that were made to hold the choshen, the breastplate, and to lock together the beams of the Mishkan, and to lock on the fabric of the Mishkan, on the leathers of the Mishkan. All of these things existed. And you think about the choshen, ma'aseh choshev, ma'aseh harash even, tefatach et ha'avanim. Look at this amazing work with precious stones that are cut beautifully and intricately to fit into this very elaborate beetle in this case. And don't say Beetlejuice 3 times. So this is just to point out how understanding the material culture of the time helps us appreciate Melechet HaMishkan. That's it for today. I want to say thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe. Please follow Tanach Study. Please follow Sefer Study and Archaeology Snapshots. And I will see you next time for Chumash Vayikra on Archaeology Snapshots at Tanach Study.